The feed sells a lot of feels, a lot of love. But is any of it real? Real love has proof. Let his love reveal what's real. Counterfeit.
So temptation in a biblical sense can be defined as an invitation to sin. Okay, it's not the sin or the choice itself, but basically it's the opportunity or the desire to do something that falls outside of the will or the commands of God. Temptation also falls under two basic categories: social and individual. I'm going to start with the category of social temptations, and to do that, I'm going to start talking about the adolescent brain, because science is cool and I think it's fascinating, and the science of the teenage brain can help us better understand the concept of social temptation in your context. When I went to seminary, we had a whole class on the science of the adolescent brain, and I thought it was so interesting and really helpful in doing ministry, understanding, well, why do we think the way that we do when we're teenagers? Because the rate of cognitive development in the adolescent years is comparable to development from infancy to 5 years old. So think about everything that happens, all the growth that happens from being a baby to being a kindergartner. That's actually what's going on in y'all's head right now, okay? And part of this explosion of development includes the increase in peer socialization versus familial bonds. You know, it's why we kind of start to pull away from our parents and begin to bring friendship and connection with peers into the forefront, because in evolutionary terms, we are beginning the process of preparing to leave the nest to then one day form family units of our own down the line. And so, you know, fitting in is this evolutionary holdover of survival because there's safety in numbers. And in our teen years, we also experience shifts in our brain structure and function that affect decision-making. And so this leads to an emphasis on the pros of a decision, even though the cons of it are fully understood. And because our brains are prioritizing peer connections, a major pro towards making a decision is often if it gets us or keeps us in good standing with our peers and friends. Conversely, a major con is if a decision does the opposite. And additionally, the reward drives in the adolescent brain increase during this time, and this leads to something called hyper-rationality. We examine just the facts and ignore the big picture. So we can place more weight on the calculated benefits than the potential risks of a decision because we miss the larger context in which a decision occurs, and the risk seems worth it because of this positivity bias, and this bias can occur especially heavily in the presence of our friends. Kaylee, what does this have to do with temptation? So I'm not up here arguing that we have an excuse for going along with choices we know we shouldn't make. We are ultimately in control of our decisions. And because of that, I think it's important to understand context and maybe why the pull of our friends or peer pressure feels so very strong in our teen years. You know, I would argue that everyone in this room has faced a decision and really struggled with how it would affect us socially. I know I have, you know, and maybe it almost felt like you couldn't resist. Because, you know, we don't want to be the goody two-shoes or the wet blanket that gets talked about behind our back or no longer invited to things. And you guys, it's not always this big peer pressure moment where in front of everyone you're asked to make this crazy choice, right? Real life temptation looks more like this. In the group chat, someone asks for tonight's answers to the homework and everyone just says, send it, and they do. And so now you have to choose whether or not to copy their answers. Or, you know, you're watching stuff online, you know you shouldn't, and the algorithm just keeps feeding you more because you're watching it and you can just keep on scrolling. Or your friend says, hey, just tell your parents you're at my house when you're really not. That's the crossroads. You know, it doesn't feel cinematic. It feels maybe like your stomach dropping, your face getting a little warm because you want to belong and you hate the idea of disappointing someone. And so you start bargaining. But the truth is, the hardest temptation is not the big one. It's the small one. The one that's easy to justify because we want to fit in, keep the peace, and not be that person. So we jump through mental hoops to rationalize it. It's not that bad. Everybody does it. I'll fix it later. We don't want to lose friends, face, or fun. But the small compromises add up. And they cost peace, trust, and the version of yourself that you can look in the mirror. And, you know, you gave into the temptation of gossiping about your friend, and you rationalize saying, oh, I'm just venting. I'm not really gossiping. I'm just venting. But now it's become a habit for you and your friends to talk behind each other's backs. And each time the weight in your stomach gets lighter and lighter, giving into the temptation gets easier and easier. Because when we face social temptations, you guys, we cannot let ourselves be swayed no matter how difficult it is in the moment. Okay, we can't let the pull to fit in and not rock the boat rule over our choice to do what God calls us to do. So I'm going to have us look at a biblical example of a situation where it would have been so easy to give into what people were suggesting. So we're looking in the Old Testament, one of my favorite books of the Bible. We're looking at the life of David. He was a king of Israel and wrote most of the Psalms. I'd argue he's probably one of the more famous people in the Bible. And so in this passage, David is on the run and fleeing from King Saul. Okay, well, why? So David had been anointed as the next king of Israel. He was chosen by God to lead his people. However, Saul was still alive and kicking and still the current king. And David actually served under Saul. And as David rose through the ranks and he became more and more popular because of all his military victories, Saul actually tried to kill him multiple times. David and his men were on the run. And so today's passage is in 1 Samuel 24. David and his soldiers were hiding in some cave networks in the wilderness. And at some point, Saul and his soldiers arrived at the same cave. Saul goes inside to go to the bathroom. And so here is David's chance to kill the man who's been trying to end his life. So 1 Samuel 24, starting in verse 3, it says, "He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, 'This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.' Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe." So let's examine this further. In verse 4, it can also be translated as, "Today the Lord is saying, I will give your enemy into your hands." We actually don't have any biblical evidence that the Lord ever said that to David. So basically, it's David's men are tired of running for their lives, and they also probably want David to be king because they can reap the rewards of working for the most powerful man in Israel. So they're trying to argue that it's God's word or will to justify giving in to the temptation before them. David faced real pressure from his soldiers here, and he's also tired of running for his life. And, we don't know what's going on in David's head as he sneaks through the caves to Saul. Is he weighing the pros and cons of killing this man? Is he praying, asking God to help him? We don't know. But what we do know is that he doesn't go through with it. Even though the temptation and the opportunity was there, David didn't kill Saul when it would have been really easy. He literally would have caught him with his pants down. Starting back in verse 5. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. So not only did David resist the temptation to fix the problems before him, he also rebuked his soldiers and prevented them from doing the same. He called them out not to demean, but to correct. Are we willing to do the same? Are we willing to do the same? Are we willing to not only resist these social temptations before us, but also call out our friends to help them resist as well? Because guys, the truth is, if we call ourselves followers of Christ, but we aren't willing to hold each other accountable when faced with temptation, we are not following God's design for Christian community. It's just that simple. You have to be willing to say what's right, even if it makes things awkward. You have to be willing to be vulnerable so that you can help each other resist temptation. And it's also not just about resisting what others say or do. We also need to trust each other and ask for help. So we've talked about social temptation. Now let's talk about the other type of temptation we face, individual. This is the stuff you face when you're all alone, when nobody's watching, and you can keep it a secret because as long as you don't tell anybody, nobody has to find out. Nobody will know. But we all know that's not really true. Right? Because to say nothing of the omniscient and omnipresent God of the universe who will know, we will know. And I'll tell you right now, speaking from experience, as much as you try and push it down in the light of day, it's still there later that night. The truth is still there. The feeling of, why can't I just resist? Or maybe the feeling of, okay, this is only affecting me, so it's fine. Or maybe God forgives everything. He's just going to have to forgive this too. I've full disclosure, I've said that quite a bit in my life. Because just like with social temptations, we try to justify giving into individual ones as well because we want the easy way and we want what feels good in the moment. So we're going to look at another story from David's life. David's one of my favorite people in the Bible because He really loved God and he was really faithful, but he also just did a lot of really crazy things and lived a very imperfect life. And so I think it's a very good example of how we are today. So this story, David's now older and he's been king for years now. And so he's in the position that God promised to him. So 2 Samuel 11:1. So it says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. So we're going to stop here and notice something important. Instead of going out and fighting with his soldiers, David's back in the palace. He's in a comfortable place and way of life. Perhaps he's letting his guard down, becoming complacent. But we don't know that for sure. What we do know is that David is in a position where giving in to individual temptation is probably easier. And so continuing in verse 2, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So then in verse 4, then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. So David has been left to his own devices. And one night as he is looking down over his city, he's able to see a woman bathe. He doesn't turn around and go inside. He watches. And since he finds her attractive, he sends his staff to retrieve her so he can have sex with her. Because it's important to understand what's really going on here, you guys. Bathsheba was not seducing David. Okay, this one was going on about her business, and David has her brought to him. Bathsheba could not refuse a summons from the king. Both as a woman and as a subject of the kingdom, she did not have any power in that situation. David was tempted, and he gave into lust. He gave into temptation, and he sinned. He didn't talk to anyone, and he didn't confess he was tempted and ask God to help him. And because he gave into this sin, other people were hurt and even killed. Because after David is told Bathsheba is pregnant, he has her husband Uriah brought home from the front lines so that he can have sex with her, and the timing of everything, they can just say it's Uriah's baby. But Uriah doesn't leave the palace gates, and he sleeps outside out of loyalty to his fellow soldiers who are camping out at war. So what does David do? He sends word to his commander to have Uriah sent out to where the fighting is heaviest so that he can be killed. Uriah dies, and then David takes Bathsheba to be his wife. He continues to pile on the sins and the bad choices to cover up what he did. And so when we give into individual temptations, it's not always this big spiraling situation like this, right? Maybe nobody finds out and it stays between you and God. But as with social temptations, the small compromises add up. They cost trust, peace, and the version of you that can look yourself in the mirror. There have been multiple times when I've told God, I know you're going to forgive me for what I'm about to do, so thank you in advance. And then I've chosen to give in to the temptation. I kept what was going on to myself, and that wasn't what God wanted for me, and it isn't what he wants for you. Okay, so how do we actually deal with temptation? First off, we need to recognize that everybody deals with it. What's tempting to me might not be tempting to you. Also, God doesn't view certain sins as better than others. Okay, we don't get to feel self-righteous because we've decided that being tempted to cheat on an exam, that's not as sinful as going too far physically with our boyfriend or girlfriend. Everybody is tempted, but everybody is given a way out. So what is this way out? Well, in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, it says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man, because God is faithful and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. So how can we utilize this way of escape? What are the practical steps we can take? Because guys, it's not just about trying harder. I promise you, just trying harder doesn't work. So first, we have to name the temptation. We have to be vulnerable and acknowledge it. Second, we have to ask what makes it easier to give in to this temptation. Is it boredom, late nights, certain people, keeping your phone in your room? Third, we have to tell somebody what's actually going on before it can happen again or before it blows up. Okay, your accountability friend does not need to be your mom, your dad, or your grandma. It just needs to be somebody who's not going to co-sign on your bad ideas. Okay, it needs to be a friend or an adult that you trust. Someone who will tell you the truth in love because they love God and they love you. You got to reach out to them. You got to ask them to ask you how it's going with this whole situation at a certain time. Hey, ask me at 10 o'clock how I did with XYZ tonight. Pair that with the boundary you're going to live this week. Maybe it's leaving the lights on and the door open when you're hanging out with your partner. Maybe it's leaving that group chat, not having your phone behind closed doors, only studying in a public place, whatever it needs to be. Fourth, you have to talk to God about it. You have to. Because I promise you, God is not looking down and watching you with bated breath, ready for you to mess up so that he can punish you. That is not the kind of God that God is. Jesus understands because he was tempted, and the Holy Spirit is with you. There is a way out, and you don't have to take it alone. God cleans the mess, and he helps you build better patterns for next time. You have to be willing to be vulnerable with God and with the people that you trust. And you also have to trust that God wants what is best for you. And you have to be willing to make the choice not to give in, because I promise you, choosing God is the right choice every time.